Hi everyone, in today's video I'll be showing you how I made this terrarium, but stick around to the end because I have an important question to ask you all, so let's get right into it. The container I'm using today is a fairly standard 2 litre glass jar with a slightly narrower neck than body. It has a wooden lid which is ideal as it will allow me to create ventilation later on. It also has quite a bit of height which will lend itself nicely to the more vertical design I have in mind. I don't have too much else to say about it, so I think it's time to begin the construction. Like all my terrariums, the first thing I needed to do was make a drainage layer. I had clay, sand and slate to choose from, however I decided slate would be more suitable as the jar is fairly large. I added large pieces of slate in the back and then filled the smaller cracks with smaller pieces, especially the edges. This not only improves the look of the final build, but it also helps build up the base of the substrate, allowing for proper drainage. To separate the slate from the substrate, I'll be using geotextile fabric as it blocks nearly all particulates and also inhabitants. This might be useful in the future, but more on that at the end. I cut around the base of the jar until I had a rough circle and placed it in, but had to trim some more off as it was a little too large at one side. The piece I ended up with was slightly larger than the jar. This causes the edges to bend up slightly, creating a bowl to keep the substrate separate. Now for the substrate I'm using a custom mix which I keep in this big container. I always reuse past substrates and place any plant trimmings here to decompose and help the microbiota thrive. I powered up the substrate and steeply moved it against the back. I plan to adjust this next, so I didn't perfect it too much. My plan for this project is to create a sort of steep cliff / plateau. This should utilise the height well, creating a really unique look. To achieve this, I wanted to create planting pockets, one higher on the right and one lower down to the left. The stepping this will create should look really cool in my opinion. I first created the pocket higher up by piling up the soil. However, after a few attempts, I realised I wanted it even higher, so I powered it up and firmly pressed the wood into the soil. Like this, it isn't super stable, however, once plants are added, it should be more secure. I repeated the same thing lower down to the left. By having the wood almost capping the sides, it creates a dedicated planting pocket and has a really unique look. The next thing I needed to do was add support to the quite steep substrate. To do this, I decided that sphagnum moss would be ideal. By plastering the sides with moss, it not only adds much needed support to stop it caving in when planting, but it also provides a perfect surface to grow moss on later on. I tried to find as many pieces as possible that had been squished down flat to cover the bulk, and I filled in smaller places with individual strands. Once I had added it all, this is what I was left with. I decided to experiment a bit with dragonstone, but quickly decided that it should be added later on. So instead, I moved on to my favourite part, planting. I've got quite a few plants to choose from, so let's briefly go through them. To start, I have this plant here. I'm really not too sure what species it is, but if I had to guess, I'm thinking it's a type of Peperomia. The next plant is this slightly purple Peperomia piccolo banda. It's got smaller leaves than the previous one, but it contrasts it really nicely. I also have these two here, Peperomia caperta rosso, which I don't end up using, but it's always good to have options, and a Fittonia, also known as a nerve plant. I do have a few smaller detail plants, but we'll use them later on. To begin planting, I planted the largest plant in the highest pocket. As with all the plants, I'd wash the roots off thoroughly of old soil. The Peperomia was then planted in the pocket lower down. This variation in height adds intrigue, and the slight purplish hue contrasts the vibrant green of the other plants, adding a much needed pop of colour. I finally added the Fittonia into the sphagnum moss. It's much lighter and thinner than the other two, and so can grow easily at such a steep angle. I push the roots through the moss and into the soil behind. At this point, I had the largest plants added, but to cover the majority of the sphagnum moss, I'm using pillow moss. I've found all of it growing near me locally, and keep it in my moss quarantine box. I filled most of the space with it, using as large pieces as possible to make it seem like it's swamp. I left a small strip through the middle, and the basin at the bottom empty. I wanted to add some more detail in the form of a twig looping over the top. I manoeuvred it until I was happy with its positioning. fill the strip through the middle, I decided to use Dragonstone. The sharp edges add much needed variation to the scape. I added a large piece at the bottom and a few smaller ones around the base. I'll add the rest near the end, once all the details have been finished. To fill the basin, I first wanted to use leaf litter, however very quickly I realised that it just didn't look right, so instead I decided to use natural sand. I added it and moved it around with a small paintbrush. I added crushed up pieces of Dragonstone to make it look like the rock was deteriorating. Smaller pieces of wood were added in the background. Now for the botanicals, I'm using what I think are a type of outer cones, but they're unlike any I've ever seen before. I placed a few in different locations with varying sizes. I also added an olive seed in the foreground to add more intrigue, and I filled the rest of the middle up with Dragonstone. To break up the large sheets of pillar moss, I'm using Ficus pumila quercefolia. Its small leaves add a great sense of scale to nearly any build. 3 were added at varying heights. I find 3 of anything, or at least an odd number, looks much better. I'm not sure why, but it feels more natural. The final plant I wanted to add was a really tiny air plant. It's a shoot that I collected from a large one I have, but I think it should look really unique here. I attached it using a small drop of super glue and held it in place until it became tacky enough to hold it, where I left it to cure fully for a few hours. I think it's time to add a few inhabitants. These aren't the inhabitants I mentioned earlier on in the video. I'll add them in a future video if you guys think it's a good idea at the end. Of course, I had to add some millipedes. These are just garden millipedes and always seem to do well in my terrariums. I carefully added 3 of them and let them move away. I also added more springtails from one of my isopod bins. These will eat any detritus. A few baby isopods were also added by accident, but I was planning to add them next anyway. Here however, you can see some mould growing on the wood. I'm sure they'll eat it up in no time. The final inhabitants I want to add for now are some tropical orange isopods. I've taken a few adults and babies from my colony and I tipped them in, and quickly they hurried into the undergrowth. Well, that's all for this video, but there's a couple things I want to mention. Over the past few days, the mould grew, but I cleaned bits up with cotton bud, and the cleanup crew quickly got rid of the rest. So, if your terrarium ever does get overtaken by mould, don't worry, it happens to most of mine, and it's just a step in the process of establishing it. Also, the important question I have, I've got quite a few ant colonies, and this would be a perfect home for one of them, probably a Lasius niger colony. However, they would most likely rearrange your scape and potentially ruin it. Not that I mind, so let me know what you think I should do. Anyway, thank you so much for watching and see you guys all next week.